Good to have your company here on Newsday. Our next guest on the program is Labor MP Tim Watts, who joins us from our Melbourne studio. Tim Watts, thanks very much for your time today. The PM on this trip, of course, in the US at the moment. He's been talking about the Australian budget can be recalibrated to ride out the trade war between the US and China, that we do need a deal on this that is sustainable and gets to the issues at the heart of this. Do you agree?
Well, Tom, Australia is a free trading nation. Our economic prosperity has always relied on access to markets beyond our own shores. Our farmers, our manufacturers, our resource companies depend on having larger overseas markets to sell to, and that's why Prime Ministers going back to Ben Chifley, Gough Whitlam, Hawke Keating, John Howard have all made this a priority of their international engagement. Now, Scott Morrison's talking about protecting the Australian budget from an international trade war, but he's in America at the moment. He's in the United States. He's been meeting with the President, President Trump. What's he been doing to leverage Australia's relationship with the United States to head off this trade war? I mean, that's the test of this trip for Scott Morrison. He's been in the Oval Office with President Trump. What has he done to try and head off what would be potentially a very damaging trade war for Australia's economic prosperity?
Well, what do you mean by head off? Should Scott Morrison be telling Donald Trump to lay down the arms on his side of the trade war?
Well, Tom, it's very difficult to win a trade war. That's the reality of the situation. We've heard a lot of talk about the Australia-US relationship, that it's based on, mateship, respect, shared values. One of those shared values used to be respect for free trade. We used to believe, have a shared value that our nations benefited from a open, liberal, free trading system around the globe. Now, Australia's relationship with America, if it is a true relationship of mateship, a relationship between equals, Scott Morrison ought to have been able to say to President Trump, mate, what are you doing here? This isn't in the interests of the United States. It's not in the interests of Australia. It's not in the interest of the international trading order to be trying to provoke a trade war like this.
Do you think, though, that China is playing by the trade rules with what it does, for example, on intellectual property?
Well, Tom, we have an international trading system that is governed by law. There are forums that we can go through to raise trade disputes. Now, unfortunately, over time, those forums have been neglected by the United States as one party. We ought to be in the ear of our friend, of our mate, saying that we benefit from the international order that was, in no small part, established by previous United States administrations and US governments. So that's what we need to be protecting. A rules-based,
but isn't this system just flat out
system
failing? I mean, China, what can we do in these rules-based systems that would stop China on currency manipulation, on intellectual property theft, where they just tell companies the price of entry is we're going to get your information out of you? I mean, people have tried the normal ways, haven't they? And they've failed.
Well, Tom, I don't agree with that. I think that we ought to be investing more in the institutions of international trade. Again, rule-based, law-based institutions of trade. I mean, look, one of the things that the US administration could have been doing is looking at trade-based, regional-based trading regimes in our own regions, something that they've pulled out of. If they want to set the rules on international intellectual property in the international trading system, they can get involved in negotiating with other nations that share those values, that share respect for intellectual property. You can build a bigger market for those properties throughout the world. The reality is, though, that trade wars, increasing tariff barriers, you just hurt yourself. And unfortunately, there's a risk that Australia could be collateral damage in a trade war like that.
That's all true. Would you agree with this, though, as a concept at least, that China is not playing by the rules at the moment for whatever reason?
Well, it certainly looks like that to me, Tom. I'm not a international trade arbitrator, but it certainly looks like that to me on a number of fronts. But there are better ways of going about this than a trade war. As I say, it's like cutting off your nose to spite your face. Raising tariffs hurts domestic consumers and could potentially hurt Australian exporters.
Labor, some criticism from the opposition today for the government committing $150 million towards linking up, I guess, businesses on this space mission from the US, saying that this money should be spent on drought instead. Couldn't you just say that about anything right now? I mean, why target the space money?
Oh, look, Tom, I mean, it's a bit difficult to know what to make of this government proposal because the details are quite sketchy. It's a $150 million commitment. Australia's had a fantastic record in supporting space exploration in the past, and we ought to continue with that record. It would make it easier to take the government's statements on this issue at face value, though, if they were dealing with problems in their own backyard first, before blasting off into interplanetary orbit. We look at the Australian economy at the moment. We have growth at the lowest rate since the GFC. We have emergency levels of interest rates, frankly. 1.9 million Australians either looking for work or looking for more work. What's the government's plan for them? We've got a $150 million announcement made for space exploration, but what's the government's economic plan? How are they bringing forward infrastructure spending to deal with the weakness in the Australian economy? The drought relief payments, very little of that comes out in the next 12 months when it's needed immediately now. Now, I see Karen Andrews this morning was saying that maybe we're going to see some kind of technology transfer from this $150 million space program to Mars, and that Australian farmers are going to be benefiting from this technology transfer. Well, I haven't heard any Australian farmers out there asking for this investment. I don't think it's near the top of their list of government priorities at the moment.
What would Labor have done differently, though, in dealing with the drought? Is there something you can point to that you would have done specifically in the lead up to this moment from the coalition?
Well, tragically, Tom, we didn't win the last election. We don't have our hands on the economic levers. We're not don't have our hands on the steering wheel of the Australian economy at the moment. Well, we lost the last election in May of this year, unfortunately. What we are calling for is the government to take action. We can have all the plans you want, Tom, but they won't amount to a hill of beans because we.
But what sort of action? I mean, do you think the government should have built a specific dam as one example, or done something different in water management over the past few years? You would have preferred to have been in power, but you still are the opposition coming up with other ideas.
Well, that was one of the things that we were discussing when we were considering the income tax packages recently. We suggested that those income tax cuts be brought forward so that all Australians got a tax cut at the moment that would flow through to the Australian economy. But as part of that, we were also saying that we ought to bring forward some infrastructure spend because the Australian economy is very weak at the moment, and the Australian government seems to be completely blasé about that. I mean, they've just got the economy on cruise control at the moment, and the direction that the economy is heading in is pretty concerning.
Related to this, the UN Weather Agency says effects of climate change increasing. 2015 to 19, likely the warmest 5 years on record globally. Should Labor take this into account when some people in the party are also saying, well, let's listen to voters. They didn't exactly endorse our more ambitious plan on climate change at the last election?
Well, Tom, obviously we need to be both listening to the scientific consensus about the very serious effects of climate change, not just for Australia, but for the future of the world in which we live. But also, reflecting very hard and learning the lessons of the last election. Now, when we come to the next election...
what should trump the other right now, in your view?
Well, Tom, I mean, it's a bit of an absurd hypothetical because what I'm focused on is the next election 3 years down the track. And at that point, we are going to have a different conversation. We're going to have to take different things into account about where Australia sits on our emission reduction trajectory. The sad reality is that...
You could also argue, though, that the choice here from Labor is, do you try to convince voters that this is a situation that needs more action, a more ambitious policy, or do you say, no, voters told us they didn't want that at the last election? I mean, that's the choice right now, isn't it?
Well, Tom, very clearly we need to be taking more action than the current government because, as I was saying, emissions have been going up in every year under this government. That's the reality. Then we're not talking about 50% or 100% emissions reduction cuts under this government. We're talking about emissions continuing to go up every year, and clearly we need more ambition than that.
Just finally, the AFP has dropped an investigation into whether former Liberal candidate Jessica Whelan's Facebook account was actually hacked. People might remember posts during the last election. Is it time for the AFP to stop bothering with these investigations? Well,
Tom, we've seen a bit of an unfortunate flurry in recent times of internet embarrassments. People are coming a cropper online and calling, "I've been hacked," calling the AFP. Sadly, the last three of those, the ones involving Greg Hunt, Christopher Pyne and the former Liberal candidate for Lions, either the investigation hasn't been cooperated with by the individual, or the AFP's investigated and found that no, there hasn't been a hacker involved. We can all sort of laugh and point at these things, but there's a serious point here in that hacking and foreign interference information operations are unfortunately a real threat faced by Australia today and all countries around the world. ASPI's found that 20 countries, the Australian Strategic Policy Institute has found that 20 countries have been subjected to this kind of interference. We need to take this seriously, and it's not helped by some people seemingly crying wolf.
So can I just ask finally, how many people have your password?
Zero, Tom. I take that very seriously. I don't replicate passwords across any of my accounts, and the only passwords in my office are held by me. All MPs should do that too. Also, two-factor authentication. Here's my plug for good cyber hygiene on Sky News, Tom.
There you go. Free advice at the end. Tim Watts, thanks for your time.